Hi everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of Recovery Talk. So today I wanted to talk about something that is unfortunately quite common in the field of eating disorders, and that is treatment professionals who kind of fear the same thing that the eating disorder fears, or treatment professionals who kind of playing on the team of the eating disorder instead of the team of you and your recovery. And often they do that without realizing. I'm going to talk a bit more in depth about what I mean about that. So I want to talk about treatment professionals maybe not challenging you as much as they should, treatment professionals who have kind of just given up on you, and also underfeeding in eating disorder recovery, whether that is inpatient or outpatient, but more oftenly it happens outpatient. This episode is for people with eating disorders, but it also is for those who work in the field of eating disorders. And if you are someone who work in the field of eating disorders, especially if you're someone who don't have lived experience with an eating disorder, I really recommend you to listen to this. I'm not implying that this episode is about you, because there's so many amazing people in the field of eating disorders, also people who've never had an eating disorder themselves. And perhaps paradoxically, I often find that the best eating disorder treatment professionals are the ones that seek out information from other sources, whether they have lived experience or not, right? They're listening to podcasts, reading books, reading studies, talking with people with lived experience. So I can kind of imagine that if you are listening to this episode, you're probably a pretty decent and curious treatment professional anyway, so I don't really know if my episode will reach the intended target in that sense. But it could maybe also be an helpful episode if you're a treatment professional and you see some of this behavior amongst your colleagues, right? And equally, if you're someone with an eating disorder listening to this and you have treatment professionals that maybe you feel aren't on the side of your healthy self, and I'm going to give you some advices on how to kind of communicate that to your team, because the truth is, very often you will need to have to advocate for yourself. So yeah, basically I'm going to explain examples of typical patterns and instances you see in eating disorder recovery treatment, where a treatment professional may be, often without realizing, taking the team of the side of the eating disorder, or reinforce disordered behaviors, or fear the same thing that the eating disorder fears. I'm also gonna explain a bit of why this happens, right? Why are treatment professionals so often falling into this trap, and how can that be avoided? If you notice your treatment team has fallen into this trap, how can you communicate that and hopefully also resolve it and work with your team? Because this is one thing I want to say. As a coach, I am not necessarily someone who just sees the treatment team and just like, oh, toss them all out, oh, they're all bad, you know? I really believe with working around a team, even if it is a team that doesn't work 100% how I work. Because I believe that even a team where there are people who maybe don't have the exact same approach as me, maybe don't have the exact same, what can I say, in cases also don't have the exact same knowledge, I still think they can provide something helpful. So for example, someone's GP may not have that much insight and experience in eating disorders, because why would they? They're treating so many different illnesses. And also we know that eating disorders aren't usually high on the agenda in terms of, medical school. It's not really something that is really lectured about that much, at least not before. Maybe it's better now, I don't know. But I often hear GPs saying that they have gotten very little training about eating disorders unless they have pursued themselves some kind of continued training or have some kind of knowledge and experience. GPs are often extremely overworked and expected to know a bit of everything. And this is not to say that that is, I guess, an excuse for GPs who are dismissive and just plain out ignorant, because I know those GPs exist and I know how much damage that's done for people. I've had that experience myself and it really made me a lot sicker. I also want to give them some grace, because I don't know if this is just my naive worldview. I think most people aren't bad, and I think most people aren't intentionally looking out to harm. I think that there are a lot of people who just accidentally are a bit ignorant. This is not to say that being ignorant, being harmful is okay just because you didn't mean to do it. Because yeah, if you are a medical professional, you have a role of authority, you have a role of influence. Of course, you should know the basics about eating disorders. But equally, I understand that GPs are human. They don't have that much training. They may not quite understand. And they're also living in the same society we're living at, where we have a lot of diet culture messaging and where also there are a lot of stereotypes about eating disorders. It is understandable that sometimes they will fall for some of this. So yeah, throughout this episode, I will try and keep some grace for health workers that are often overworked, sometimes also underpaid, expected to know everything, expected to do a lot of things, and probably are quite, tired, to say it frankly, and don't really know. Like, I want to keep some grace and give them the benefit of the doubt that they are not intentionally being hurtful or harmful. Even though I have to admit, there are times where I've just been wanting to shake my head and be like, oh God, what are you doing? Why did you say that, right? I often will have clients who come to me and their doctor or someone said something that's just so ridiculous that I just want to And it puts me in a weird situation, right? Because as a coach, I'm not medically responsible for my clients, right? And that is a very important part of how I work. I'm not someone who does the medical bit, right? So I need to leave that work to someone else. But equally, sometimes, I'll say, yeah, check that with your GP, go to the doctor. But then my clients or also people I talk about with eating disorders in general might do that and get dismissed, right? And that's why go to your doctor. It's a bit of a difficult advice sometimes, right? Because you don't necessarily know how they are met by the doctor. Then again, I think there is a difference between, someone having good intentions and wanting to support you and wanting to do their job but just not quite getting it, versus someone being dismissive and rude and also, putting you at risk mentally or physically. Unfortunately, I have experienced the latter. I will never forget how it went when I went to the GP for an eating disorder. It was not a good experience. I was dismissed. And you know what? The eating disorder part of me was very relieved. My family couldn't believe what I was saying when I said, yeah, my doctor told me I was fine. And it's such a tricky position because as a patient, especially patient with a mental disorder, I'm probably the one in this situation that's going to be disbelieved, right? Because a doctor has a certain authority, right? So the doctor's version of event and my version of event was not the same. When my family spoke to the doctor, they're like, what on earth? And the doctor was kind of like, oh, just didn't want to scare her, didn't want to didn't want to, no. And my family was just like, wait, what? And I was so frustrated because I was, the mentally ill one, right? How can someone believe my version of events when I say that my doctor said I was fine? That was what the doctor told me, right? And I think this is a sad thing that I see often in eating disorder treatment, where because the person is, quote unquote, the sick one, right? They're kind of disbelieved, not listened to, seen as, not worthy of having their autonomy and voice heard and taken into consideration. And don't get me wrong, there are times where maybe that is a bit necessary, right? If someone is deep into an eating disorder, they may not be able to see their situation clearly or make rational decisions, right? So I do understand it to some extent, but equally, I think that people with eating disorders deserve to have their voice heard in treatment and work with the team against the eating disorder. And this takes me to one of the things that I see a little bit too often, and that is teams working on the side of the eating disorder and not on the side of the healthy version of you. A classical example is the case of labeling someone chronic. Someone has a chronic eating disorder, and this is controversial also within the field. Me personally believe that there is no such thing as a chronic quote unquote chronic case where recovery is not possible. And I think using those labels is incredibly discouraging in terms of, getting someone into recovery. If you're told that you're chronic, you're essentially told this is a chronic condition, you can't get better from this, you can't fully recover. Maybe you can get a bit functional, but you can't fully recover. And I think that's incredibly disempowering, because how can they know that? If they base it on the person's past, okay, but there are people who've had eating disorders 10, 20, 30 plus years and still have recovered, just like there are people with alcoholism who suffered for a long time and still recovered. There are even cases where the chronic label is thrown out rather shortly, It's not necessarily something that you need to be sick for 30 years to have that label. I see young people who've been sick for, a few years having been labeled as chronic. And I understand I understand the idea behind the chronic in terms of tailoring care. If you have a treatment resistant client that you know is not necessarily going to comply when you are presenting options such as breastfeeding or weight restoration if that's necessary, or quitting certain behaviors, if you know they're not going to comply unless forced, I understand that chronic can be a way of, saying this person, we're not necessarily trying to make them fully recover. We're instead just monitoring behaviors and making sure they're medically safe. A little bit similar to how if someone is a drug user, right? How if the treatment system may have kind of given up a bit on them. So instead they're at least providing them with clean needles and, managing risks and harm reduction, basically. So I see the concept, but I think that you can do that without telling someone you can't recover, right? You can say that this is a complex case. You can say that this is an ongoing case. You can say that the person is not necessarily at a point where they are pursuing recovery and you are medically monitoring them instead. But I don't think you should tell someone with an eating disorder that they are a chronic case and will have this forever. I think that you may have the vulnerability forever. That's absolutely true. So I think that someone with an eating disorder, they can go into remission, recovery, right? But they will always have a vulnerability if there is a period of energy deficiency that something is switched on, right? And equally, they always have that vulnerability that, certain things will be triggering for them. For instance, they can probably never go on a diet again because there is an almost allergic reaction to the state of undernourishment. I tend to think of myself as someone, I have a genetic predisposition to an eating disorder. I know that I can never diet again. I mean, I don't have any desire to, but I also know that I can't. And I know that I need to be careful, make sure I don't end up in an energy deficit. So yeah, you can maybe describe someone like this person has had a chronic eating disorder for a long time, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you can predict the future, right? That this person will for always be chronic. And if you're telling a patient that, they're not really going to collaborate with full recovery, right? Because you're telling them that this is not possible for you. But what evidence do you have for that? Yeah, it is true statistically, if someone's had an eating disorder for a very long time and they're completely a post-recovery treatment, yeah, I mean, I understand that it may not feel that hopeful, but there is still hope, because sometimes what people just need is a different approach and a team that listens to them, team that supports them, right? I've seen this over and over, and I've worked with people who've had eating disorders for decades, and they have pretty much been given up on, right? And then I see when they meet someone who believes in them, who works with them, who tries to actually, give them autonomy in their recovery and collaborate with them, I see amazing progress. And these people are often so frustrated that they have been given up on by the system. They know they've been given up on by the system, and that made them kind of just not really try. And then they get someone who actually believes in them. They get a new team, and then they progress amazingly, right? So if you're listening to this and you have been labeled chronic and you feel like, hey, actually, that doesn't really fit me, I actually think that there is more in store for me in the future. I want you to remember that you have the power, right? No one else can put that label on you, right? And say, you are chronic, you can't recover. That doesn't mean it's easy. It doesn't even mean that it's statistically super likely. But it means it's possible, right? If someone has, let's say, a cancer with a very bad outcome risk, they don't tell them there's no way you're going to recover. You tell them maybe, oh yeah, you actually do have a 10-20% chance, but most likely you won't, right? And equally, in the case of that person with the cancer, you probably would have really made them hold on to that hope that, yeah, it actually can get better, right? And I think that we should have that same approach with eating disorders. And we also know that with eating disorders, with the right approach, with focus on refeeding, weight restoration, rewiring, we know that recovery is possible. We know that the odds are not tiny. The odds are pretty decent. Maybe some of you will call me idealistic for this, but I've just seen too many long case, so-called labeled chronic cases of eating disorders turn their lives around and recover for me not to believe that it is possible. But that is my view and my ideal world. So the reality is, if you are someone with an ongoing, persistent eating disorder, you have not necessarily responded well to treatment in the past, The truth is, your team, your medical providers are probably going to treat you as a chronic case. That's just the hard reality of it. That does not mean that it is okay for you to, keep pursuing restrictive behaviors and, stay at medical risk. It doesn't mean that that is okay, right? This is the problem very often happens is if someone has been labeled chronic, they think that justifies them staying at the stage where they're at and doing distorted behaviors. Because it's kind of like, oh, well, if it was that bad, my doctor or my psychologist would have told me not to do it, right? But the truth is they are literally just trying to collaborate with you and work based on your pattern. They're seeing that it's been years and years and you have not really responded, then they are kind of gonna give up a bit. I know that is hard to hear, but that is just how it is, right? That's just how it is, at least in most cases. Nevertheless, you can then choose to be like, well, they're giving up on me, so I'm going to give up on myself. Or you can actually advocate for yourself and be like, hey, I know that I haven't necessarily responded well to treatment in the past, but I'm now at a point where I want to give this recovery thing a try, right? I want to work towards full recovery. And then if you have a good team at that point, they should then shift their treatment approach to maintenance and just making sure you're, not dying essentially, to actual improvement. And if you feel like your team, even after you've communicated that you are changing gears a bit, you still feel like they are not, on your side in terms of pushing for recovery, you also can think, hey, maybe this is not the right team for me. Maybe that was a better team just to maintain, making sure that I was staying stable medically, but maybe now I need to change it up. Maybe I need to work with a new therapist or doctor or coach or whatsoever. You don't need to stay stagnant because they are. Because at the end of the day, with staying stagnant, your team is not the one suffering the consequences. You are. Your doctor or therapist or dietitian whatsoever, they're going to go home to their lives. You're the one who's going to go home to your eating disorder. And yeah, you can spend the rest of your life stagnant because almost out of spite for your team. Oh yeah, but my doctor said this or my dietitian said that. You can do that, but again, you are going to suffer the consequences. That's just a hard truth. We can play the blame game all we want, but you are the one living your life. And it's so important that you advocate for yourself and take responsibility and change it up if you feel like stagnancy is occurring, or that you are communicating to your team that, hey, this is what I need right now. This is what would be the right thing for me to do. And I know it sucks that so much of this responsibility is on you, but again, I'm here to offer realistic advice. I'm here because I want you to do better. We could spend this whole episode just shit-talking doctors and how incompetent they are and how society's wrong and diet culture this and that. We could do that, but that would just keep you in a bit of a victim mindset, right? And you know what? You may be a victim, right? You might be a victim, but what are we going to do about it? What are we productively going to do about it? That is what I'm interested in. What kind of actions can we take to work around this? This is not to let doctors or society off the hook, not at all. But I think we can do several things at once, right? We can discuss how things in the medical system is broken, how there's so many unhelpful stereotypes about eating disorders, etc., etc. And we can also, focus on your recovery and what you can do under these circumstances, under this system and society. And practically speaking, advocating for yourself is so, so, so important. I understand it's scary. Understand your eating disorder hates it, right? So a good example is maybe you have been given a meal plan by a dietitian. Realistically speaking, you know that meal plan is too low in calories, right? And of course, your eating disorder is like, well, this means that I'm not allowed to eat more, right? But you know very well that you need more food. And you know that this is too rigid, too restrictive, too this, too that. Advocate for yourself. Tell your dietitian, hey, I really appreciate you, supporting me through this, but I also feel like I'm still quite hungry. And I feel like in order for me to get to full freedom, I would need to eat more freely and I would need to eat more. I notice my body needs it, my brain needs it. A good dietitian would then take that into consideration and work with you, right? And if your dietitian is completely dismissing that, is that really a dietitian worth working with? I think any treatment professional, if they're client or patient tells them something isn't working, that should be taken into consideration. And that goes with coaches as myself as well. I always encourage my clients to tell me if something isn't working, if there's something they want to do different, tell me so we can work around it. Because everyone, we're all working in this field. We are humans, right? As mentioned, we are humans. We can make mistakes. We can see things one way when the clients see it another way. That is literally part of it. That doesn't make you a less good practitioner, but how you solve these issues are. That what makes you a good practitioner or a bad practitioner. If you are ignoring your client, if you are just dismissing, if you're just like my way or the highway, that is a bad practitioner. This does not mean listening to your client's eating disorders. This is a huge difference. You need to be able to differentiate when it is the eating disorder speaking and when it is the healthy part of them speaking. And this can be difficult. I'm telling you, as a coach, sometimes it can be difficult to know, but that is something to figure out with the client. So I want to talk about underfeeding in recovery for a second, because that's what I mentioned as an example. Very typical example. Someone get a meal plan from a dietitian that is just way too low in calories. So what I want to answer here is, why on earth does this happen? Why? Because I see it over and over, right? And I remember when I first started discovering this pattern, I was pretty confused. I was like, why? Like, what is the point of this when you have a disorder that we know needs quite a substantial amount of food to resolve, right? Why are then people still being given low calorie meal plans? So first of all, the reason why people in early recovery are given lower calorie meal plans is actually to reduce the risk of refeeding syndrome. This is not necessarily bad. This is actually quite important. If you are someone who's acutely undernourished, potentially underweight, or you've been engaging in a lot of high-risk behaviors such as purging, you may be at risk for refeeding syndrome, which is basically a set of metabolic disturbances that occur with refeeding. And this can be very dangerous, right? And that is why medical supervision, whether inpatient or outpatient, some kind of medical supervision and collaboration is important in recovery. So basically what happens in this case is that someone is given a low-calorie meal plan so that they can gradually increase their intake to avoid the risk of refeeding syndrome. This is just responsible medical practice. The problem, of course, is when this persists beyond the point where someone is in refeeding syndrome risk. So for example, someone may be out of the risk of refeeding syndrome, but they are still given a low-calorie meal plan of, let's say 2,000 calories. And here is what I have realized throughout my years in this world of eating disorders and recovery. Very often, dietitians or therapists or doctors will intentionally give a person a lower calorie meal plan to make it, they think, more manageable for the client. They know that you have a quote-unquote fear of calories and they want to collaborate with you. They don't want to scare you. They don't want to overwhelm you. So they say, fine, we can agree on a lower calorie meal plan. The problem, of course, is that what you will tend to hear, someone with an eating disorder, you will tend to hear, well, this shows that I cannot eat above this. And it creates this harmful idea in your head that this is your allowed maximum. When actually very often it is just your team trying to kind of collaborate with you. Unfortunately, in this case, what happens is the team kind of takes the side of the eating disorder and they fear that you won't be able to handle it if it is more. And you know what? You kind of, let's be realistic, you kind of have probably given them a bit of a reason to do that. Not in every case, but a lot of cases, people will say, oh, they have been basically begging and pleading for the team to not feed them so much, and then the team gives in, and now they're angry at the team for underfeeding them, right? But then again, there are also cases where it happens without necessarily the patient or client's involvement. Because realistically speaking, there are also, unfortunately, some dietitians who don't really know that much about eating disorders and the energy needs for eating disorders. In eating disorder recovery, someone shouldn't just eat normally and that's fine. No, they need a lot more food. They need food for metabolic healing, which I've spoken about before. They need food for potential weight restoration. They need food for their body and their brain. And also they need rest. And unfortunately, there are some dietitians who think that the solution to an eating disorder is just to give them a random 2,000 calorie meal plan and let them follow that. But that doesn't really give enough for that healing to happen. But the thing is, someone can weight restore in a lower calorie meal plan, right? And very often how they measure progress in eating disorder recovery in, the medical system is simply just through weight gain, right? They don't really look at that many other things. And the truth is, someone who's metabolically suppressed can gain weight on a very low intake. So somehow your team thinks, well, let's do it on a lower intake then. You're scared of calories, so why would you go up? We know we can weight restore you, but on a lower intake. What I think the treatment teams in this case often don't understand is that very often the person with an eating disorder actually want to be metabolically, healed. I see this very, very often with clients. The thought of recovering whilst metabolically suppressed scares them. Eating more also scares them, right? Which creates this little paradox. And I think treatment teams don't know that people with eating disorders tend to want to eat more in recovery because they want to heal the metabolism. And also because very often people with eating disorders like to eat. Excited about food, that's completely normal. I did an episode about that, about being excited for recovery food and how that's completely normal. Your brain is literally wired to find food and eating more rewarding. And I just don't think that dietitians or doctors or therapists always understand that and how someone can be terrified to eat more and also excited about it. And the same thing goes for weight restoration. If you're someone who's underweight and part of your treatment is to weight restore, you may have been given a target weight or a goal weight by your team. And more often than not, this target weight or goal BMI is in the lower end of the quote-unquote normal BMI scale. What is important to emphasize is that this is a minimum. This is not a maximum. But of course, the eating disorder loves to interpret when it is a minimum, it's actually a maximum. It does that with calorie needs, it does that with weight, etc., etc. And I actually spoke to my sister about this because she's a psychologist and she specialized in eating disorders. She doesn't work with eating disorders now, but she used to do. She worked on inpatient hospitals, so she's pretty knowledgeable about the topic, right? And I was talking to her like, what is going on with this, BMI 20 thing? Like, I can understand setting it as an absolute bare minimum, but how come in a lot of cases patients are told when you reach BMI 20, we're going to work on maintenance? Why are the treatment team almost scared of them going over? In some cases, not all cases. Thankfully, in my case, my team was kind of like, actually going above the minimum, it actually has advantages. So I was actually talking to her about it. Like, why do treatment teams seem to be scared of weight gain? Because funnily enough, the treatment team that are saying, BMI 20 then maintenance are usually more than BMI 20 themselves, because statistically speaking, BMI of 20 is uncommon. Most people are naturally at a higher BMI than that naturally. Not everyone, of course, there exist people who are naturally very slim, so they're naturally BMI of 20, but most people aren't. And she was basically just explaining to me, very often it's because treatment teams are scared that the patient or client won't handle more weight gain than that. So basically, even though we know that weight restoration to one's set point weight range, not some random BMI 20, we know it needs to be at someone's set point weight range, we know that that is actually correlated with recovery. Because if your natural BMI is, let's say, 23, but you're maintaining BMI 20, you're not really going to be fully recovered until you reach a weight that's natural for your body, because you're still suppressing your body weight. And ironically, you then will probably be more able to handle a BMI of 23 when you're at your set point weight compared to always staying at a suppressed BMI 20. You're not going to fully recover in that 20. Yet treatment teams often miss out on this whole thing with set point weight and how it affects you to be suppressed below your set point, and instead are kind of like, we're scared that you won't handle more weight gain because clearly you are afraid of weight gain. When funnily enough, what tends to happen is the body dysmorphia actually tends to lessen when someone is weight restored compared to when they're underweight and still under the set point. For example, in my case, I felt a lot bigger when I was smaller because my body dysmorphia was so influenced by me being weight suppressed and energetically suppressed. When I started hitting a healthier weight range for my body, I started seeing my body more realistically, and I also felt better about my body in some strange way. So it's kind of strange because treatment teams, they know that body dysmorphia is the important, in many cases, not all, but important component in eating disorders and the resistance towards weight gain as a result, right? So they know that. They also know that body dysmorphia tends to be lessened with full recovery and weight restoration. Yet at the same time, they're scared that you will not handle the weight gain when they know that the weight gain is associated with handling weight gain. Does that make sense? It makes no sense to me. And I will say, when I talked to my sister about this, she was kind of saying like, it's silly. It's silly. It's not really how it should be. Everyone has a different set point weight range and people should be in their set point weight range, right? And this once again goes back to what I spoke about with you being the one who will suffer the consequences. Yes, you may have been told by your treatment team, 2,000 calories, BMI 20. You may have been told that. But the truth is, you are the one who's going to suffer the consequences from staying weight suppressed, from staying metabolically suppressed, from always under eating, from not rewiring. Because rewiring part is another common one where a treatment team will kind of only care about you putting on weight and putting, or increasing your intake, and they don't really care about challenging fear foods. Again, I see this unfortunately sometimes because they only measure recovery in, weight gain, which is important. Please don't make it seem like I'm saying that weight gain, if you're underweight, weight restoration is not important. It 100% is. If you're under your set point weight range, regardless of your BMI, you need to restore to your set point range, even if you're not clinically underweight. But yeah, basically, you're the one who'll suffer the consequences if you're not doing these things. Your team, they're kind of just following protocol, an outdated protocol in my opinion, but it's the protocol. Just like there's been so many outdated protocols, especially in psychiatry in the past. I mean, homosexuality was labeled a mental disorder. They're performing lobotomies. How many things do you think that we are doing in psychiatry or psychology now that we will look back at in 10, 20 years and be like, oh my God, that was outdated? I think our view of eating disorders in a few decades from now are going to be very different than it is right now. I think there's going to be more investigation into the biological components, more investigations into the more scientific bits of it, not just analyzing everything, but also looking at, hey, what actually happens in the body, right? And more focus on the fact that science is implying that a lot of it is actually a evolutionary biological response to famine, right? Meaning that you can't really just talk yourself or think yourself out of an eating disorder, you also need to eat yourself out of it. I also like to add something, and that is that sometimes, unfortunately, some treatment professionals are themselves invested in diet culture, influenced by diet culture, right? And it kind of makes sense. A lot of people who are, let's say, chronic dieters, they tend to be very gravitated towards foods, and they're probably more likely then to pursue a career that has to do with nutrition, right? And maybe become nutritionists, nutritional counselors, dietitians. Of course, I'm not implying that every single dietitian is secretly disordered around food, because that's just not the case. But studies have shown that there is a disproportionate amount of disordered eaters, especially more in like the orthorexia range, amongst nutrition students or dietitian students than the general population. So unfortunately, you may have a dietitian that is themselves quite invested in diet culture and has, favorable view of restriction and weight suppression. And if so, honestly, I think you should get a new dietitian. Yeah, you can try and educate them, and sometimes that can be helpful, handing them a scientific study or a helpful article. But in a lot of cases, they're not really going to be receptive to that. I always recommend, if you're working with a dietitian, work with someone that is trained in eating disorders. This does not mean that if someone is trained in eating disorders, they automatically know everything and are perfect, because there are people who are trained in eating disorders who really should not work with eating disorders, in my opinion. And equally, there are some dietitians that are just so logical and straightforward and common sense that they don't even need to be specialized in eating disorders to know that if you're always hungry, you need to eat more. If you're underweight, you need to put on weight. And it's funny because I was venting a bit to a friend of mine about how frustrating I find it that some eating disorder practitioners underfeed their patients and clients. And he was literally just like, wait, isn't more food the treatment for an eating disorder? Why are they not giving them more food? Don't they need a lot of food? Isn't that what they need? And this was someone who literally has no clue about eating disorders except listening to me talking about my job. Yeah, that was just a logical bit, right? And it's interesting how someone who literally barely knows about eating disorders can just say, obviously you need more food. But then sometimes people within the field that go so heavily into analyzing it, they're like, oh, no, being cautious, treading carefully, when it's pretty simple. If you're hungry all the time, you need to eat more, right? And I think this can be a trap that some practitioners fall into, especially maybe people who are more trained in, let's say, psychotherapy, where everything is being seen through that specific lens, right? So a psychotherapist, for instance, you come to a psychotherapist and you say, you know what, I'm hungry all the time. Due to the psychotherapist training, they're kind of going to see, oh, well, what void are you trying to fill here, right? When actually the truth is you are energy suppressed. You need to eat more. And you can't really psychoanalyze your way out of your body being undernourished, right? In the same way, someone may say that they're tired all the time, and you can go and see, oh, well, what are you not fulfilled in your life? No. What, are you depressed? Blah, blah. But then you see, actually, they're severely sleep deprived. You kind of should fix the basic needs first, right? And that's the thing. when someone is hungry all the time, you need to actually first check, are they actually getting enough food in, right? Are they actually at a weight that their body is happy with? And I think that viewing eating disorders through simply one direction and not the other is not really it, right? I think eating disorders need to be viewed as a condition that is metabolic, it's biological, it's psychological, it's sociological. You need to view it through different areas. And I think the problem, and I know even as a coach, I can sometimes fall into this trap where I view things one way, not the other, right? This is just human. We will always view and approach things through our own training, right? And I think that's why having a team can be valuable. You can have a dietitian who, if a skilled dietitian, will see things nutritionally and focus on, okay, nutrition rehabilitation. Then you have a psychotherapist that can see, okay, how does this actually like got started in the first place? Maybe you were bullied as a child and you decided, or maybe bullied as a teenager and you decided, hey, losing weight will solve my problems. But I still think that for eating disorder treatment, it's important to see the bigger picture, right? You can see, for example, that yes, someone's eating disorder may have started by them being bullied and starting a diet as a result, but then it is the genetic predisposition towards an eating disorder and the state of undernourishment and potential weight loss that triggered something that got started in the brain, almost like a switch was flipped. And then as a result, there are certain medical complications that can be monitored by a GP. There is a need for refeeding that can be looked at from a dietitian's point of view. But equally, I understand and acknowledge that not everyone has access to that size of a team, right? So I would recommend when working with someone, as someone with an eating disorder, try and find someone who knows a bit of everything if you can. If you don't have a team with 10 different people, work with someone who has a base knowledge of eating disorders and is able to see the bigger picture. And in my opinion, maybe most importantly, is able to implement the 4 R's of recovery, which is rest, rewiring, restoration of weight, and refeeding. I genuinely believe that without these 4 pillars, you cannot fully recover. And I know a lot of people wish they could, right? Oh yeah, I'll rewire, I'll, rest, but I'm not going to gain weight. Or, okay, fine, I'm going to gain weight, but I'm definitely not going to challenge my fears. If you build a house on 3 pillars, right, the house is going to shake, right? You need the 4 strong pillars to build the house. If not, it's going to be uneven. Okay, guys, this was a bit of a long episode. And I know one thing that a lot of you are going to wonder now is, okay, so I've been given a lower calorie meal plan from my dietitian or treatment team, or they kind of, go in that route. What do I do now? Or, oh, I've become weight restored on low calories. What do I do now? I will touch upon this in next episode. So tune in next week where I will talk a bit more about weight restoration on a lower amount of calories and what to do if you have, made that route in recovery. Okay, guys, I hope you enjoy this and I look forward to speaking with you guys next week. I will not do a listener question for this episode just because the episode is becoming so goddamn long. But I will take a listener question next week. Okay, guys, enjoy the rest of your week, and I look forward to speaking with you next week.